Hi, this is Kristen Denton, and I'm presenting my article for this week of Zoo Experiences, Conversations, Connections, and Concern for Animals, originally authored by Clayton, Fraser, and Saunders. So some quick background information to get you guys all up to speed. Zoos are around in order to sort of elicit conservation of biodiversity, animal care and welfare, and environmental education of zoo guests. Animals housed at zoos are usually used to promote conservation and nature as a whole in this context, serving as ambassadors to their species. So sort of being representative of wild populations that may be critically endangered or threatened. So this conservation messaging for zoos and therefore also aquariums, for it to really work, these institutions need their guests to not only get the message, but to actually act upon the message. And that usually comes in the form of behavioral change. So doing something different that will help support wild animals. So this study had some research questions, like what part of a visit elicits a sense of connection to the animals on display at a zoo, and which part of that relates to concern about animals. How learning a sense of connection and concern may be created or enacted during a zoo visit, since that'll likely lead to behavioral change, which is the ultimate goal. And the third question is the distinction between an individual animal and its species important to guests, since we can only put sort of representative individuals on display. So this research was basically broken into two sub-studies, which could have probably stood alone, but in this case they're one and the same. So the first study was a visitor's survey about animals seen on exhibit, getting visitors' opinions on their emotional and perceptual reactions to the animal, attitudes about protecting that individual animal and its species, and intent for visiting the zoo. And this was done through convenient sampling of 206 adult visitors based around 4 particular species on display at the Cleveland Zoo. So some results of this, they found that actually most people don't go to the zoo to learn about animals. But what's interesting about that is that if you look at what they thought the main purpose of the zoo was, it was to teach visitors about animals and conservation. So that's sort of an interesting thing that they're not going there to learn about animals, but they recognize that that's why zoos are there. So kind of interesting. Other data that they got were this is sort of that perceptual connection to animals, emotional connection, and attitudes towards animals. And so then they compared basically the reasons why people came to the zoo to these facets of their understanding and feelings towards animals. So really what they figured out was that people had a greater concern for an animal when they learned something and got a sense of connection with the animal. And if they came to the zoo to learn rather than simply entertainment, because then they're already pretty much primed to learn. So the second part of the study, they were really trying to understand the extent to which visitors respond to their animal exhibit experiences as a learning opportunity, whether they recognize it as learning, and how guests use the animals to facilitate social interactions within their group, and whether guests had an enhanced sense of connection or similarity to the animal, and whether guests expressed positive, negative emotions, or both. So how they did this was actually sort of observations. So they would observe the length of time that guests stayed in an exhibit, whether they read exhibit signs, and then they would actually listen in on guests' conversations. And they would categorize these conversations based on some of these categories. So describing, making inferences, imitating, all kinds of things, lots of things. And basically what they found out was that 27% of guests look at exhibit signage. Average time at an exhibit was only 99.3 seconds. And most visitors, more than 90%, made no statements other than describing. So saying, look at what it's doing this. That's just describing. That's just sort of hashing it out like you're on a radio. And then here's here's that basically in proportion of visitors making comments in each of those categories. So really that describing was really high up there, a lot of describing. That's kind of an entry-level thing. So these descriptive statements illustrate the use of the animals to foster social engagements between guests, because they were talking. So most people aren't there to learn, but it can happen.